It's no ordinary voice of spiritual ventriloquism. You are listening to Dummy himself. Well, we are still here at Sukkot. Brother Lev is the cameraman. Yep, Brother Mars and Doc. Brother Sahan. We're all here. We're going to give a little bit of a short reading, teaching, lesson, whatever, on Sukkot. And the first place we see that appear is in Genesis 33. And it says here in Genesis 33 that, let me turn to there real quick. It says here in Genesis 33:17, and Jacob departs to his tents, and he made for himself their habitations. And this is a place called Sukkot, okay? And he made for himself habitations for his cattle. That means sheep. He made booths, therefore he called his name that place Booths or Sukkot, okay? So anyway, this is one of the precursors to the festival of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles today. And one thing that's interesting about Sukkot, and especially is in reference to our Messiah and the circumstances surrounding the timing of his birth and whatnot, that this festival of Booth comes into play again, and through the prophets and even in some of the Targums, this is spoken of these circumstances. So anyway, he comes, he pitches his tent at Sukkot, and that's pretty much what we call Feast of Tabernacles by its Hebrew appellation. And he pitched his tent, or he pitched his tents, him and his son, there, and then built booths for his cattle. Now, why build booths for cattle? First, you have tents. They're already living in tents. As you can see, there are a lot of tents around here. We've been staying in these tents. But through the scripture itself, and that's a local custom because we can't invite 500 people here to chop down all our woods every year to build themselves booths or sukkahs. So we suffice it by just dwelling in tents. Israel already had tents to dwell in, so the booths had another significance. And the fact that he built these booths for his sheep was not so the sheep could take, not for them to sleep in necessarily, but it was meant to give them a refuge from the heat of the sun during the course of the day. So booths, tabernacles, the booths were designed to contain, like the articles of feasting, your table, and everybody would go by from one booth to another. They would mingle and fellowship with one another, dance, make merry, and just celebrate the goodness of Yah. And after they had come into the land, and so. We know that that these booths were built primarily for sheep, and that's the earliest reference to this, and that it was for daytime. What do you say? Repose would be a good word for it. To just to kind of be out of the direct sun, and not necessarily to sleep in, because Israel already had tents that they dwelt in throughout the whole year. So, at any rate, but if it's a local custom to be in tents, that's fine. I'm just trying to put things in its original context. So, fast forward to the time of the Messiah, okay? We know that the whole story about Joseph and Miriam had to come and be taxed at the city of his nativity, which was Bethlehem, but they could come at just about any time to do that during the course of that census that Romans were taking. I believe it was Augustus census. And then they were levied at that particular point as to what their tax would be to the empire as a family. And anyway, so he comes to Jerusalem and he can't find any lodging there. Why was he coming to Jerusalem? Well, he was coming for the feast. The only time I think one would have an issue finding lodging in Jerusalem would be during the feast days. What do you think, Brother Marcus? You lived in Israel for what, 14 years or something like that?
Right, yeah. Probably be pretty packed around that time.
Would that be an accurate assessment that the reasons the hotels and the inns?
Yeah, all males being required to come up to Jerusalem for the feast day, that would probably make it pretty packed. You had all of Israel coming up, so yeah, you'd have to find where you could.
Make reservations or something, huh? Yeah. Okay. So, being that he couldn't find any lodging, his wife is heavily pregnant. You know, there really wasn't any requirement for her to go because, as you said, it was all males were required to appear before him. You know, obviously, wives came along and children and stuff.